It's time for Recipe of the Day. So yesterday, I did a very long episode on this podcast about making pierogies, and today I'm doing what I think is probably going to be also long, although probably not quite as long, of an episode about how to make cabbage rolls. So these are Ukrainian holubtsi. These are the ones, if you've had the Ukrainian ones versus the Polish ones, they tend to be a little bit smaller. So these are about 2.5 inches long and an inch wide, whereas some of the other varieties can be as big as 4 inches long. They're like big cabbage rolls. These ones are quite petite. The other big difference is that some kinds of cabbage rolls have a filling that is mostly meat. Traditionally, the Ukrainian ones have less meat, or even they're made with buckwheat and no meat, especially at like Christmas Eve. We do the meatless dinner, so then they wouldn't have any meat in them at all, or they have just a little bit of meat. The ones at my parents' Ukrainian restaurants were originally with rice and a little bit of bacon and onions as the filling, but nowadays we make them with rice and ground beef, and I want to say it's like half rice, half ground beef. And those are our favorites. And that's what I'm telling you about today. But really, the key thing about making these is knowing the steps and how to prep them, how to roll them, and how to cook them, how to freeze them as well, more than it is what the actual filling is. Oh, I guess the other thing that I'll say about the filling and differences between different cultures or different families even is whether the filling is cooked or not. For this version, the rice is cooked and the meat is cooked before you put it into the cabbage. I know that for a lot of people, either the rice or the meat or both are actually left uncooked in there. I'm not sure why this is different, but this is the way we do it. And I promise that they are delicious and you're going to love these. So I'll say that I'm doing this audio version for you here, but there is a post at cookthestory.com with all of the information and with pictures, and there's a video coming soon too. So if there's anything you're not sure of, you might want to look there. Usually I think the audio is sufficient to really get things across, but these are a little bit tricky. So if you're not sure, go and have a look, and I'll let you know when that video is out as well. So the basic steps for making these, almost like a roadmap to this episode, is you make your filling, and I do find it easiest if the filling is not cold. Like you could make the filling the day before, but it's like crumbly and I find it harder to work with than if it's still kind of warm, like cool enough to handle, but still warm. So you're going to make your filling. That means making your rice, cooking your meat. I'll tell you how to do that. You're also going to make a tomato mixture. I use petite diced tomatoes mixed with raw onion, and that's the juice from the tomatoes as well. And that mixture is added to the layers of cabbage rolls before baking them, and it helps keep them moist and luscious. It kind of like helps to really keep that rice nice and steamy inside. I'll say here that some people use tomato sauce instead, and I know my mom sometimes uses like tomato juice poured in there, so there's lots of options, but I am telling you how to do it with the diced tomatoes. Then we're going to prep the cabbage. That means coring it and blanching it. That's simmering it in water. We're going to line our baking pan. I'm going to tell you how to do this with parchment paper and with cabbage leaves both. That really stops them from burning and helps create a nice seal inside the baking pan so that those cabbage rolls are steaming beautifully in there. And I'm also telling you how to get that filling rolled up inside the cabbage leaves and then how to bake the cabbage rolls. I'll also talk a little bit about freezing them. And that's because, as with the pierogies, I tend to make a fairly large batch when I do this. It's time consuming with lots of steps, but once you're all set up and have everything going, it's easier to just keep making more. And so I always make enough for the freezer. Okay, before we jump in, I'm going to let you know that this is a recipe for 1 large head of cabbage, which, depending on your experience and how big the cabbage is, you're going to get 20 to 35 cabbage rolls from. I know that range is very big, but cabbage size is big, and then sometimes some of the leaves are more damaged than others and you can't use them. And if you are experienced and good at this, you can cut larger leaves in half and get 2 cabbage rolls from each one. And if you are less experienced, you probably want to stick to 1 cabbage roll per leaf. So that's why the large variation in the yield here. And I'll tell you, even for me, and I am very experienced at this, I take notes every time I'm making the cabbage rolls of how much filling I've made and how many heads of cabbage I needed. And like thinking that, in the future I'll have it like nailed down. It'll be perfect. I'll know exactly how much cabbage to buy and how much rice to make. And my notes are things like 2 heads of cabbage, 75 cabbage rolls, 1 head of cabbage, 22 cabbage rolls, 3 heads of cabbage, 118 cabbage rolls. And you're just like, how on earth is this large difference in numbers happening? And it is really what I was saying. The size of the cabbage, the quality of the cabbage. And also, like, if I'm doing a whole bunch, I get better as I go. So I'll get more towards the end than at the beginning. So that's what's going on there. You are going to start by making your filling. So you're going to cook 1.5 cups of uncooked white long grain rice according to the package instructions, being sure to salt the water as it's cooking, like when you're first mixing it together, because you want it to taste really good. Also, I'll just say that while that rice is going, you want to get some water going for blanching the cabbage, because we'll be doing that after the filling's made. So get out a big pot, like 5 to 6 quarts, and fill it like 3/4 full of water, cover it and bring it up to a boil. Once it comes to a boil, leave the cover on and reduce the heat to low, and it'll be ready for us when we want it later. Okay, while the rice is cooking, you're going to cook your meat. Melt 2 tablespoons of butter in a large skillet over medium heat and add 1 large onion that you've chopped up, and you're going to cook and stir that just until softened, just a few minutes. Then you're adding 1.5 pounds of lean ground beef. You could also do half ground beef and half ground pork. That's delicious. You could do ground beef with some bacon, also really good. And to that, you're also adding a teaspoon of garlic powder and half a teaspoon of salt and half a teaspoon of black pepper. Cook, stirring that occasionally until the meat is no longer pink. Then transfer the cooked beef mixture to a large bowl and stir in your cooked rice. And depending on the instructions that you followed for cooking the rice, if there was water, you drain it first. Usually when rice cooks, it soaks up all the water though. So you want not watery rice added to your beef, and then you give that a taste. It should taste really good. Most of the seasoning is going to be coming from the filling, so it should be delicious. You want to just keep eating it. You can't stop because it tastes so good. If it's not that good, add more salt, pepper, and garlic until it is delicious. And okay, you're going to set that aside. You just want it to become cool enough to handle while you're getting the cabbage ready. Now, while my cabbage is blanching is usually when I make the tomato mixture, but if you're doing this for the first time, you don't necessarily want to be multitasking. So I'd say make the tomato mixture next in a medium bowl. Mix together 2 14-ounce cans of diced tomatoes with their juice. I like the petite diced if you can get them. And also 1 large onion that you've chopped up fairly finely. Mix those together and set that aside. Now, your water should be up to a boil. You want to core the cabbage, and I will link to a demonstration of how to do that, but you're basically keeping the cabbage whole and you're cutting a cone like angled in to the core, going about 2/3 of the way into the head of the cabbage. And then you've removed the core, and then you're going to put that whole head of cabbage into the boiling water. Very careful. And you're going to stir that, kind of like turning it in the water occasionally so that all sides of the cabbage are getting heated. Once the water comes back up to a boil, you're going to drop it down to a simmer, and you're just turning that using tongs to turn it in that hot water. And then every now and then try and see if your tongs can get the outer leaf kind of off of the cabbage. As the leaves soften, they will come off of the cabbage more easily. So as soon as you can loosen a leaf off, pull it off, pull off a few, and then let them kind of sit around that bobbing head of cabbage. And you want them to be soft enough that you can sort of fold them in half and the vein of the cabbage gives way. So it's soft enough. It's been softened enough that you can fold it without the vein breaking. If the cabbage is still undercooked, it would just break at that vein. You don't want that. So you want it nice and soft so it folds. Once they fold, you remove them from the water and transfer them to a plate. You're going to make a pile of cabbage leaves, pulling them off of the head of cabbage with your tongs as they loosen, letting them cook for a minute or 2 until that vein is softened, and then transferring them to your pile. And actually in that pile, because they're all hot, they kind of continue to cook in there as well. So if you're in doubt, if you're like, this seems soft, but maybe not soft enough, put it in your pile because it's going to keep cooking and softening in that pile. Now, as you're transferring those leaves out of the water, any that are really dark green or that are torn or like discolored in a weird way, or the really small leaves from the middle that would be too small to fill, keep those separate because we're going to use those for a very special, important purpose. Now, once all your leaves are out of the water, you don't need the water anymore, so you can discard that. I will say that you can go with a paring knife and remove all the veins from the leaves. You kind of slide your knife so that it's parallel to the cabbage leaf, slicing off the vein because you don't want that thick vein in your cabbage rolls. It's just going to be tough and not good. So you could take those all off of there. I tend to do this deveining step as I go, so I wouldn't do them all at once like that, but you might want to. If you're new to this, again, it's one of those things that you're just trying to like do things in steps, right? But what I would typically do is when I'm all ready and I'm making the cabbage rolls, I take a leaf off the pile. If it's really big, I'm probably going to cut it in 3 pieces. So I'm not even going to bother slicing the vein off. Instead, I'm going to cut right along the vein on one side and right along the vein on the other side and end up with 2 vein-free pieces of cabbage to use. And then the vein goes into that pile with the ugly cabbage that I told you is going to have a special purpose. It goes over there. So yeah, I would take a leaf off of the pile, and if I'm cutting it in half, that's what I would do. If it's smaller and it's going to be one cabbage roll on its own, then I would slice that vein off going as I go. So up to you if you do them all at once or if you do them as you're making the cabbage rolls. Okay, we have one more step for before we actually start stuffing the cabbage, and that is to get our baking pan ready. Now, I tend to use 8 by 8 inch foil pans for this. And that's because, like I said, I usually make these for the freezer, and I find an 8 by 8 inch pan can hold anywhere from, 10. You could just put 10 in there, one layer of 10, all the way up to about 20 cabbage rolls in one pan. So then I usually would do from one head of cabbage, I would do 2 pans, maybe one's for dinner tonight. Maybe I only put 10 in there, and then I put the rest in the other pan. And generally when I'm serving cabbage rolls, if it's for a bigger dinner, like this is just one side dish as part of a larger dinner, I guess around 1.5 to 2 cabbage rolls per person, in which case, a roasting pan with about 15 to 20 is going to be perfect for that larger group of 7 or 8 people, right? Also, if I'm doing cabbage rolls for our main course, like a family dinner on a weeknight, for instance, then I'm doing more like 4 per person, in which case having a pan with, 16 to 20, and there's 4 of us. So we have our 4 each for dinner, and then there's some left over for lunch the next day. So that's why I like to use the 8 by 8 inch foil pan. Also, since they're going into the freezer, I don't want to use my casserole dishes that I cook in all the time, because then they would be in the freezer and not in my drawer where I need them when I'm cooking, right? So that's why I use those. No matter what you're using, you're not going to ever want to do more than 2 layers of cabbage rolls. So you do some on the bottom and then you do another layer on top. You don't want to do 3 layers. They get squashed too much. So just keep that in mind. And the other thing that I'll say is no matter what you're using, you want to line it very well. And that's because it takes quite a while for the heat to penetrate to the middle of your pan or your casserole dish and to penetrate all the way through and then to really steam everything and cook it properly. Like they're going to be in the oven for 2 to 3 hours, depending on a couple of things. And because of that, the cabbage rolls that are at the very edges, they can burn. And you do not want burnt cabbage rolls. So what we do is we protect them really well. And the way that my parents did this in their restaurants and what I do now is I take that 8 by 8 inch foil pan and first I line it with parchment paper, a big piece of parchment paper, so it's hanging over on all 4 sides. And then I squish it into all the corners and along the edge with my fingers. And then that's when you use those ugly leaves, the cabbage leaves, the really dark ones or torn ones, veins that you've taken off if you have those already. And you're just going to do a single overlapping layer of the leaves on the bottom of your parchment lined pan, kind of having those also like all along the bottom, but also lay over the edge. So they're hanging over with that parchment paper. And that's because after the cabbage rolls are all rolled in there, we're going to sort of fold all those cabbage leaves and parchment paper up over. And that's going to help create our like steam bundle in there. Okay. So you have your parchment paper, that's overlapping the edges. Then you have this single layer of cabbage leaves that you've kind of like slightly overlapped on the bottom, and they're kind of falling over the edges as well. And then that is when you take some of that tomato mixture. You'll want about half a cup of it, scoop that out, the liquid and the tomatoes and the onions, and just sort of spread it out in the bottom of your pan so it's going on top of those cabbage leaves. Okay. Now you are ready to start stuffing the cabbage. Whether you're starting with a smaller leaf that's just going to make one cabbage roll, or a halved leaf if you feel ready to handle that, or a big leaf, whatever you're using, you want to put it on your work surface in front of you so that it is curved towards you upwards. You know, picture that head of the cabbage. It's a ball, right? And so you want what would have been on the outside of that ball to be downwards. And that's so that when we're rolling our cabbage rolls, we're working with the natural curvature of the cabbage, not fighting against it, right? Okay, so now you've already taken the vein off if you're doing that, or you've cut it in half, right? You're going to put about 2 tablespoons of your rice filling into the middle of your piece of cabbage. Now your rice filling is probably still nice and warm, but probably cool enough to handle at this point. You're going to put it in your hand and kind of push it a little bit. Especially if you're new at doing this, it's going to help sort of hold it together in the middle of your cabbage, make it easier for you to roll it up around there, okay? So you're going to make almost like a little tube of your filling, and that goes in the middle of the cabbage. And then I'm going to give you an expert tip here. You really want to be making use of the softest, thinnest, nicest, lightest colored pieces of cabbage possible. And you want to therefore prioritize those bits from each leaf. So if you're looking at a leaf and it's got that nice soft frilly end on one side, that's going to be gentle and tender and good. And on the other end is where like the vein was thickest. You've cut it off, but it's still a little bit there. You want to prioritize that softer edge. So we're going to want that to be in the middle of our cabbage roll. So turn that nicer edge towards you, your filling's in the middle, and then you're going to pull up that nicer edge up over the filling, and then bring in the 2 sides burrito style, and then roll the cabbage away from you so that it's in one bundle. Now you can keep rolling so that you end up with more than one layer of cabbage around the filling, but I don't like that. They're not as tender. I think you end up with too much cabbage flavor. So instead, once you've put that side that was closest to you up over, and then the 2 sides from the 2 sides over as well, and then rolled it one time, I take a paring knife and just trim away any excess cabbage that hasn't been rolled yet. And then you're picking up that cabbage roll and you're putting it seam side down in your prepared pan on top of the tomato mixture. And then as you're rolling these, you're tucking them in, not like crazy tightly that they're going to start squeezing and falling apart, but like pretty firmly tucked together. They help hold each other together. And what's really amazing is even if they're kind of ugly and uneven at this point, as they cook in steam, they plump, and they're pushing against each other, makes them all kind of become more homogeneous, makes them all the same. And I'll say also that if you have any parts where your cabbage rips a little bit, or where things are falling apart and you thought your leaf was big enough, but it's not, you can kind of patch things together. Take a little piece of cabbage that you're not using, maybe from your discard pile, or if you just have some that you've trimmed off, and kind of use it like a little Band-Aid, a little patch. You can even put 2 leaves together if you need to make up for one that wasn't big enough. And don't worry if they don't look nice. You're not going to be able to tell. Once they're all tucked in there and then cooked later, you won't even know which ones were the ugly ones and which ones were the nice ones. You won't know which ones needed a patch and which ones didn't. It's kind of amazing. So you're going ahead and making those, and you're filling the bottom of that pan. I get between, 8 to 12 in the first layer, and then you season them nicely with salt and pepper over top. How much is kind of up to you, but I think of it as like if I was having some bland mashed potatoes and I wanted to salt and pepper them at the table, about that much salt and pepper. Then you do another half cup of the tomato mixture spread out over there, and then you can do another layer of cabbage rolls on top of there. Now, if you're using the 8x8 foil pan, you might think that it's not tall enough for the 2 layers. Just make sure that your second layer is inside the bounds of the first layer, and then when we wrap everything up, it's going to be fine. So you do that second layer of cabbage rolls, then do another round of salt and pepper and another half cup of the tomato mixture on top of there, and then you're bringing those ugly cabbage leaves that we're laying folded over the edge of the pan bring those up over. And then in the center where any cabbage leaves aren't meeting, you still have exposed cabbage rolls showing there. You're going to put more of those ugly leaves or trimmed veins that you have, anything just to protect those tops there. Okay. Now bring up the parchment paper also on all four sides that was hanging over. Bring that all up as well. And then cut another big piece of parchment paper. Put it over top, and you're actually going to tuck it in, gently going between the foil pan and your previous parchment paper. So it's kind of going outside of everything except for the pan all the way around. You're going to have to like smoosh in the cabbage rolls with your fingers to get the parchment to go down in there. But don't worry, you're not hurting anything. Just go all the way around all four sides. Okay. Now, what you've done there is you've protected those cabbage rolls from burning, but you're also creating this like steam packet. All of that tomato liquid in there, everything is going to be trapped, and it's going to steam and make that rice stay nice and plump, and it's going to cook the cabbage and make it really tender and cook the tomato too. It's really, really perfect. Okay. One more step is to wrap it in foil. You can wrap all the way around, or you can crimp around the edges. And then I'm going to tell you how to bake these and how to freeze them. Whenever you are baking them, I recommend that you put your foil pan onto a larger baking sheet. And that's just because they're in the oven for a long time. There can be some simmering and boiling over sometimes. It doesn't happen every time, but when it does, it makes quite a mess in the oven. So put a baking sheet under your pan. And then if you're baking them right away, they're going into a 350 Fahrenheit oven just until a fork slides really easily through. So you're going to kind of unwrap it all a little bit and then put a fork right through one of the ones in the middle. It's going to take 2 to 2.5 hours. Just note though that once they come out of the oven, they stay hot for a really long time. So if you're baking these to have as part of a bigger dinner or something like that, you can take them out and just leave them. They'll stay hot. One trick is actually to take a towel, like a big clean bath towel, and wrap that around the pan as it comes out of the oven. And then you can even put that in a cooler. They're going to stay hot for a long time. Just make sure that you eat them within 90 minutes for food safety reasons. When it's time to serve them, you're going to remove the foil from the top, take the top parchment off, loosening it all the way around, and then take any of those leaves that we put on the top off of there. And you can pull out any that are sort of showing that don't look nice, that are around from the bottom. Everything's going to be really soft and they'll come out easily if you want to. It's fine to leave them there though. And then just serve them straight from that foil pan. They are delicate. They're not going to fall apart. If you try to transfer them to a nice serving platter, they'll be fine. But everybody can just do them themselves from there, and that's going to be the easiest thing. Now, as I mentioned, my parents made these at their restaurants and tested a whole bunch of stuff, and they found that it is best to freeze them before baking them. So you get that foil pan ready, everything exactly like I said, even the aluminum foil on top, and I actually usually write on that aluminum foil what's inside, 20 cabbage rolls and the date. And then you can put that just as it is in the freezer or put it into a big zip top bag, and they're good in the freezer for a good 3 months. And then when you want to bake them, it's best to thaw them a bit. So take them out of the freezer and leave them in the fridge overnight, but you can bake them straight from frozen. If you've let them thaw, even if they're a little bit frozen still, that's fine. They're baking at 350 Fahrenheit for 2.5 to 3 hours. If you're going straight from frozen, it's going to be more like 3 to 3.5 hours. I will say one other thing though, is that you want to add moisture if you're cooking them from frozen, because freezing rice really kind of dries it out. So if you are thawing them first, after they've thawed, just before you put them in the oven, open up that like foil parchment as best as you can, and then drizzle in 1 cup of tomato juice, just kind of like spreading it around by tipping the pan a bit, maybe pour in a couple of different places, and then seal it all back up. And that's just going to really help keep everything plump and amazing. Now, if you didn't thaw the pan of cabbage rolls before you're baking it, they're still frozen solid. You're going to put them into the oven for an hour, 350 Fahrenheit again for an hour, and then heat up a cup of that tomato juice until very warm. You don't want it to cool down everything in there. And then same thing, kind of loosen the packaging a little bit so you can get right in there and drizzle that tomato juice around, put it in a couple places, shake the pan a little bit to try and get it to distribute, and then seal it back up. and then finish baking from there for your total time of 3 to 3.5 hours. The first hour without the tomato juice, the rest with the tomato juice having been added. And same test for when they've been frozen. You want that fork to be able to go into one in the middle really, really easily. That cabbage is so tender. Everything is lovely. And same thing, they will stay warm for a very long time. Okay, that is how you make cabbage rolls. This is probably actually my longest ever episode. I thought the pierogi one from yesterday was it. It is this one. Thank you for listening. I hope you give this a try. If anything didn't make sense, definitely go to the recipe on Cook the Story. I'll put the link in the show notes, or you can head to cookthestory.com/ROTD and get it there. Everything there is arranged by date, so it's helpful to know that today is April 21st of 2025, and you'll see the pictures and all the explanations, the recipes at the bottom. You can jump down to there, and the video is coming soon. I am Christine Pittman from cookthestory.com, thecookful.com, the all-new chicken cookbook, and from this podcast, Recipe of the Day. I hope you have a great day. Let's get cooking.